They said bull elephants never stay, but he did when it mattered most. The calf was barely breathing. Its small chest rose and fell in weak, erratic rhythms, and the mother, exhausted from the birth, lay unmoving on her side. The herd had formed a circle around them, watching from a distance. Some mourned already, others prepared to move, because nature taught them not to wait too long for what might not last. But he didn't move. The father, a massive bull, scarred from years of fights and solitude, stood rooted at her side. He had never been part of births. That wasn't his role. That wasn't expected. But something ancient flickered in his eyes as he lowered his head toward the calf. His massive trunk brushed gently across the newborn's skin, not out of curiosity, but connection. Then he did the unthinkable. He knelt, a creature built for power, for dominance, for solitude, folded his knees and curled his massive body around the two smallest lives in the clearing. He made himself smaller, quieter, still, and in that moment, the herd didn't lead. He did. He didn't move for hours, not even when the wind picked up or the sky cracked open with distant thunder. He stayed massive and still, as if his sheer presence alone could hold back whatever danger the world might send. And maybe it could, because something in the way he looked at the calf said, "I am here, and nothing is taking you from me." The calf whimpered once, legs trembling as it tried to rise. The mother barely stirred, but the bull leaned down, not to lift, not to fix, but to steady, to let that tiny form lean into something solid. And when the calf's legs gave out, it collapsed against his chest, and he let it. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn away. He simply breathed, letting his heartbeat become the lullaby that kept the calf tethered to life. And the others? They watched, unsure, uncertain. This wasn't what bulls did. They passed through. They protected the outside, but never entered the inside of things. Never stayed for the fragile beginning. Never softened for the sake of something too small to offer anything back. But he had. And that changed everything, because the calf lived through the night, not because of strength, but presence. The kind that doesn't rescue with force, but with stillness. The kind that doesn't ask anything in return. The kind that teaches a brand new heartbeat what it means to feel safe, not just to survive, but to begin. By morning, the mother lifted her head, weak but breathing. Her eyes found his, not with surprise, but with recognition. She had seen him fight storms before, but never like this. Not with tusks or thunder, but with silence, with shelter, with stay. And the calf? It took its first full steps beside him, not behind its mother, but tucked between them both. A family not made by nature's rules, but rewritten by love. A trio moving as one, not because of instinct, but because of choice. Because sometimes the most protective thing anyone can do is not to lead, not to save, but simply to remain. To stay when no one expects you to hold space when others walk away, to teach new life that presence is the greatest strength of all. Because it wasn't just about protection, it was about imprint. Every breath the calf took with his father's shadow over him rewrote what safety meant, not with roars or declarations, but with the soft, steady rhythm of being there. When fear trembled through tiny limbs in the still dark hours before dawn, it wasn't warmth that comforted. It was the quiet weight of something massive choosing not to leave. The calf didn't need stories. It didn't need to be told it was loved. It could feel it in the earth, in the way the bull's body curved like a shield around him, in the way every danger was held at bay by something too silent to be seen, but too powerful to be ignored. And as the sun began to rise and the herd inched closer once more, curious now, not distant, something shifted. They didn't question him anymore. They followed, not because of dominance, but because of reverence. The calf stood now, not steady, not strong, but upright, and at his side stood the one who hadn't walked away, his father, his first memory, his beginning. The mother, though weak, leaned her body against the bull's side, not because she needed to be carried, but because she had witnessed something she didn't know she could believe in. That love could be quiet and still move mountains. That leadership didn't always look like roaring. It could look like kneeling. That beginnings didn't need fanfare to be powerful. They just needed someone willing to stay long enough for breath to return. That's what he gave them. Not just protection, but permission to take their time, to heal, to learn what love looked like. Not in motion, but in presence. He wasn't just a bull anymore. He had become gravity, anchor, shelter. And as the calf took another step, and another, each one not toward the herd but toward him, something settled into place. Not a title, not a role, a truth. That the strongest bonds are forged not by instinct, but by intention. And sometimes the greatest strength in the world is choosing to stay soft when everything else tells you to walk away. Because walking away is easy when the world expects it. When nature itself has written you into a role that ends at the edge of birth. When strength has always been defined by distance, by the ability to move on, to roam, to protect from afar. But he stayed, and in staying, he rewrote everything that had ever been assumed about what it means to be a bull, a protector, a father. He became the still point in a spinning world, the place where fear could rest, where healing could start, where time slowed down enough for something new to grow. And as the days passed and the calf's steps grew surer, it wasn't just his muscles that developed, it was his understanding of what presence meant. He learned to walk not alone, but beside. He learned that leadership could feel like warmth, that home could be found in a shadow, in a breath, in the way his father turned slightly every time he took a step, just to make sure he was still there. The herd adjusted around them, not because they were told to, but because they felt something holy in the space he created, a kind of reverence built not on dominance, but on devotion. The calf became the center not just of attention, but of belonging. Because this wasn't a moment that ended. It was a new way of being, a family shaped by choice, not chance, a future built not on survival, but on staying. And even when the mother regained her strength, even when the calf could run and stumble and laugh through the dust, the bull remained close, not hovering, not controlling, just there, like a silent vow etched into the earth with every step he took beside them. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need to be noticed. His presence alone was the promise, one that said, I won't leave, not when it's hard, not when it's quiet, not when no one's watching, because staying, real staying, isn't about fear or duty. It's about love, the kind that makes room, the kind that says, even if I was told to go, I'm choosing not to. Because that choice, quiet, unseen, uncelebrated, is the foundation of everything that lasts. It's not written in the rules of nature. It's not instinct. It's not what's expected from a bull elephant who should have already disappeared into the dust. But he stayed. He stayed when she was too weak to rise. He stayed when the calf cried through the night. He stayed when no one knew what came next. And that made all the difference. In the stillness of his presence, something began to bloom that no storm could wash away. A rhythm, a bond, a memory taking root not in words, but in the ground beneath their feet. The calf didn't know what he would become. He didn't know about the dangers that still lurked beyond the trees, but he knew this. Safety sounded like his father breathing beside him, like the rumble of strength that never had to shout, like the quiet of being held without being gripped. And so every night, when the stars rose above the plains and the herd finally settled into silence, the calf would nuzzle close. Not because he was afraid, but because something in him understood that this wasn't just survival, it was home, it was legacy. It was a story being written not in the loud moments, but in the still ones, in the pauses, in the steady presence of someone who simply refused to leave. He would carry that presence in every step he took, even long after his father stopped walking beside him. It would echo in the way he stood his ground, in the way he waited before moving on, in the way he made space for others without needing to be asked. That silent teaching, that love expressed not in action, but in unwavering stillness, would become the heart of who he was. Because sometimes the strongest thing a parent can do isn't to lead or protect or teach. It's to remain when it's hardest, when it's quietest, when no one's watching, just to remain. Because in that quiet, unmoving choice, lay the most radical act of love the calf would ever know. Not the loud heroism of battle, not the roaring defense of danger, but the sacred patience of a father who said, with every breath and every step, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." And the world softened around them because of it. Other bulls wandered nearby, watched from a distance, unsure of what they were witnessing. This was not dominance. It wasn't force. It was something else entirely. A power rooted in stillness. A loyalty that wasn't tied to instinct, but to a decision made deep within. Unchanging, unshakable. The kind that rewrites everything, quietly, without asking permission. And it did. It rewrote the calf's sense of what strength could be, what fatherhood could mean, what family truly was. The calf, still small and learning, didn't know how rare this was. He just knew that when he stumbled, there was always a shadow waiting to steady him. When he cried out, there was always an ear turned toward him. When the nights were long and the world felt too wide, there was always a body close enough to feel safe beside. That closeness wasn't temporary, it wasn't performative, it wasn't loud, it was real, and it stayed. And as the mother healed, slowly but surely, she watched something unfold beside her that had no name in the language of elephants. But she felt it, in the way her calf grew, not just in size, but in soul. In the way his spirit remained soft, unafraid, unbroken. In the way he looked back at her, not just with love, but with trust, because he had never learned abandonment, not once. What the bull had done was nothing and everything. He had simply chosen to remain. Day after day, moment after moment, heartbeat after heartbeat. He had taken the weight of the world off their shoulders, not with strength, but with stillness. And that became the ground they walked on, not made of soil or stone, but of something far more enduring, memory. Memory of what it meant to be protected without pressure, loved without limits, seen without expectation. The calf didn't know the world before this, before gentleness, before presence, and maybe that's what made him different. Not softer, but more rooted. Not weaker, but unshakable in a way only those who have been truly held can ever be. The bull never asked for anything in return. He didn't need recognition. There were no trumpet calls of praise, no rituals of honor. His devotion was not performative. It was instinctual, yes, but not in the way nature defines instinct. This was something more, a choice repeated so consistently, so quietly, it became the rhythm of their days, a rhythm that kept the mother grounded, the calf balanced, and the entire herd subtly steadied, because others noticed. The matriarchs, the cousins, the calves from other mothers, they all watched. And though the bull said nothing, did nothing grand, the ripples of his presence spread like water on cracked earth. The herd shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, not in structure, but in heart. The young ones grew less afraid. The tired ones rested easier. Even the skies above seemed softer. One day the calf would walk alone. He would face storms, hunger, separation, and the quiet loneliness that finds all who roam. But he would carry something others could not see, a blueprint of steadiness, passed down not through DNA, but through demonstration. A knowing that strength was never the loudest force in the room, but the one that remained when everything else walked away. That is what his father gave him. That is what staying becomes. Not a moment, but a map. Because maps are not just for the lost. They are for the remembered, for the ones who one day stop and ask, how did I survive? And in the quiet of that reflection, they'll trace their path not by the loudest moments, but by the ones where someone chose not to leave, where someone didn't run, where someone stayed. And that imprint, though invisible, becomes the compass that leads them through storms of their own. The calf grew, slowly at first, cautious of the world and its chaos. But each time he faltered, he looked to the bull, still there, still watching, still walking just close enough to catch him if he fell. Not crowding, not commanding, just being. And in that consistent nearness, the calf's fear shrank. Not because danger disappeared, but because he was no longer alone in facing it. The mother, stronger now, walked again with grace. But in her healing, she didn't forget. She saw the moments that hadn't belonged to her. Moments where she couldn't be the one to comfort, to shield, to hold, and how he had, without resentment, without reward. And that, to her, was the most intimate form of love. One that doesn't demand space, but holds it. One that doesn't ask to be thanked, but becomes unforgettable because of it. Seasons passed. The calf's steps grew heavier. His tusks began to form. And still, the bull didn't leave. Others came and went, moved on, moved out. But he remained. Not because he was trapped, but because he had found freedom in being needed, in choosing his herd over wandering, in finding purpose not in territory, but in togetherness. And what began as an exception became a legacy. Because legacy isn't always carried in names or footprints. Sometimes it's in the pauses, where fear could have led to silence, but presence stepped in instead. Sometimes it's in the way a calf stands taller without knowing why, or how a mother rests easier because someone else kept the night watch. Sometimes it's in what isn't said, but passed down anyway, like strength wrapped in gentleness, like protection that never needs permission. The bull never told his story. No trumpet ever announced his loyalty, but it lived in the herd, in the way young ones played more freely, in the way elders looked back more often, in the way the land itself seemed to bend a little softer where he stepped. His choice became more than behavior. It became culture. It became memory etched into bone, into soil, into wind. One day, long after his tusks dulled and his steps slowed, he would walk behind them, watching the calf lead a path he once cleared. And he would see it then, in how the young one paused when others fell behind, in how he stayed close when someone else was hurting, in how he didn't rush, didn't abandon, didn't need a reason to remain. He simply did, because it had been done for him. That is how legacy survives, not by force, but by repetition, not through dominance, but devotion. A love that doesn't ask to be understood, only felt. A decision so quietly brave, it echoes through generations. He was never the loudest, never the biggest, never the first to be seen. But he was the one who stayed. And because of that, everything changed. Because change, when rooted in love, doesn't shout. It unfolds, quietly, gently, like the way his shadow began to fall beside theirs, not ahead. Like the way the calf no longer needed to look back to feel safe. He just knew. It was in the way they slept closer, breathed slower, and walked farther without fear. That kind of transformation doesn't need an audience. It just needs a moment brave enough to begin. And that moment had started long ago, with a bull who could have left, who could have followed instinct, who could have lived a life untouched by the messiness of birth, of pain, of waiting. But he didn't. He stayed through the unknown, through the bleeding, through the trembling stillness of whether she would wake. And through that choice, he showed that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in what you conquer, but in what you commit to. The calf would never remember the moment he was born, but his body would, his heart would. It would remember that it was never alone, that its first breath wasn't drawn in isolation, but into a world where someone had already chosen him. And that knowing, deep, primal, unshakable, would shape everything he became. Even the mother, though she had no words for what had happened, carried it with her, in every look, every breath, every time she brushed against the bull as they walked side by side. A quiet acknowledgement that said more than trumpets or gestures ever could. Thank you for staying, for making space when I couldn't, for being more than what the world expected you to be. They didn't rewrite the rules of nature. They didn't have to. They simply lived in a way that made the old ones feel smaller. Because sometimes all it takes to reshape what we believe is one quiet life lived differently. One presence that refuses to walk away. One choice to stay, even when no one is watching. That's how revolutions begin. Not always with noise, but with nurture. Not through rebellion, but through tenderness shown at the exact moment it would have been easier to leave. The calf grew, stronger, braver. Not because he was told how to be, but because he was shown. His courage came not from dominance, but from being surrounded by presence. He didn't have to fear the unknown, because love had met him there first. And so he walked through the world not with armor, but with awareness, of connection, of protection, of a father who had knelt down when it mattered most and never stopped standing guard since. And in that calf's shadow walked stories older than memory, of a bull who taught the herd what power looked like when it paused, what strength looked like when it softened, what family meant when it included staying, not just protecting. There were no words for it, only the way the herd moved together now, closer, calmer, bonded not by instinct alone, but by intention. This wasn't just a new beginning, it was a continuation, a quiet evolution written in steps, not sounds. And every one of those steps led back to a moment when one bull elephant made a choice: to be more, to stay, to love, without needing a reason. Because the truest love doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask if it belongs. It simply shows up again and again until its presence becomes a rhythm in the lives it touches. That's what he became. Not just a protector, not just a mate, but a steady echo of love that didn't waver when things grew quiet, that didn't pull away when the wounds took too long to heal, that didn't need to fix everything to remain. And as seasons passed and the calf learned the language of wind, water, and earth, there was something unspoken guiding him, a memory not made of moments but of feeling, of safety wrapped in sighs, of footsteps that never left, of a world where softness didn't mean weakness, but safety. He would become the kind of elephant who waited, who stayed, because someone had once done that for him. The herd, too, was different, not in shape or sound, but in soul. They had seen what it meant when a bull stayed behind, when he didn't follow the old rules, when he carved out space not just for strength, but for surrender. That changed them, not overnight, but over time. It made them linger longer when calves were born. It made them more careful with each other. It made them more whole. No one gave him a name for what he had done. There was no ceremony, no story passed in trumpeting celebration, just the quiet continuation of something rare, something real, something that softened the hard edges of their world and reminded them, sometimes the boldest thing a giant can do is kneel. And from that kneeling came a new kind of power, not the kind that roared or charged or conquered, but the kind that waited, watched, and held. That power lived in the silence between heartbeats, in the stillness of nights where nothing stirred but the breath of those who felt safe enough to sleep. It lived in the space he never left, even when the others moved on. In the quiet way he shifted his weight to make room, in the way his shadow became shelter. Because staying isn't passive, it's deliberate. It's an act of choosing over and over again, even when there's no applause, no witness, just the inner knowing that presence matters. That being there, truly being there, is the beginning of everything. The calf would grow tall, strong, with a memory like the roots of the oldest tree, deep, far-reaching, impossible to unearth. And in that memory, etched not in words but in knowing, would be the shape of a father who had bent low enough to lift a life too small to stand on its own. And in doing so, had built a legacy no thunder could shake. So when the time came, and the young one stood at the edge of his own path, he didn't wonder what to do. He waited. He stayed. Not because he was told, but because he remembered. Because someone once knelt and in that stillness showed him how to rise. And when he rose, it wasn't just muscle or age that carried him. It was memory. Memory of presence. Of the weight that had once steadied him. Of nights he didn't understand, but still felt safe. Of warmth that never demanded anything in return. So he rose not to walk away, but to stay, just like he had been shown. That became the blueprint. A silent teaching passed, not in words but in action, in footfalls that echoed with patience, in strength that didn't need to be loud to be real. He became the kind of elephant who stopped for others, who bent low when someone was too weak to move, who waited long after the dust had settled, because once that's what saved him. The herd noticed, so did the earth, the way he stood between storm and silence, holding space the same way he had once been held. And through him, the story continued, unchanged in its truth, but alive in its retelling. Because what had begun in a moment of fear, of blood and breath and uncertainty, had turned into something unshakable, a legacy not built by dominance, but devotion, not marked by volume, but by presence. And in a world that always seemed to favor the strongest, it was his softness that lasted longest. Because softness, when chosen, when held on to despite the ache of the world, becomes a force nothing can undo. It seeps into the soil like memory, wins through generations like music, and lingers in the air long after the footprints have faded. His softness wasn't weakness. It was wisdom made visible. It was patience wrapped around pain. It was love stretched into something so constant, even time bent to it. And that softness shaped everything. It taught the young one that being powerful didn't mean being loud. That real leadership sometimes looked like silence, like shadow, like stillness. That you could change the course of a life not by shouting your love, but by staying where it hurts until it heals. And that healing, when passed from one body to another, becomes a legacy that nothing, not time, not distance, not even death, can take away. So he grew, not just in height, but in heart, carrying that softness into a world that needed it more than it ever admitted. And every time he paused, every time he stayed, every time he knelt, he remembered, not the birth itself, not the pain or the fear, but the shape of his father's stillness, the curve of strength made gentle, the moment where everything that seemed impossible softened and survived. And survival in its quietest form became more than just breath. It became a promise, a thread that ran from one life to the next, unseen but unbroken. It meant that presence could be inherited, that kindness could echo, that just one moment of choosing to stay could ripple forward until it rewrote the whole rhythm of the herd. He didn't need to understand all of it. He just lived it, carried it in the way he stood between storms, in the way he circled back when others moved on, in the pause before action, in the hush that followed his steps. Because what had been given to him was not just protection, it was permission to love differently, to lead differently, to stay. And long after the others had forgotten the night he was born, he remembered, the scent of soil still warm, the press of his mother's side, the way his father had leaned in, not away. Those memories didn't fade, they deepened, not just in his mind, but in every gesture, every pause, every time he chose compassion over command. Because what survives, teaches, and what teaches, lives forever. Because forever isn't counted in years or distance or size, it's counted in echoes, the kind that move through generations like breath, in footsteps that follow a rhythm taught in silence, in the way someone pauses without knowing why, in the exact place where loved ones stood. That's what he left behind. Not a monument, not a story told with pride, but a way of being, a truth so soft it could only be learned by staying close. He never asked to be remembered, but he was, in the way the calf walked slower for the weak, in the way he stood tall but never alone, in the way he bent when it mattered most. He became part of the ground, part of the wind, part of the pulse that moved beneath every step the herd took from then on. That's how presence lasts, not by force, but by being felt, again and again, in the quiet moments, in the hard ones, in the kind that don't make it into stories, but shape the ones who do. His legacy didn't roar, it breathed and it stayed. It stayed in the soil they walked on, in the shade they found shelter beneath, in the pauses between thunder and calm. It stayed in the eyes of every young calf who didn't know the full story, but somehow understood safety. It stayed in the hush that fell when strength was quiet, and in the way the herd moved with a rhythm older than memory. Because what he gave them wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, it was steady, it was there. When others left, he remained. When storms rose, he leaned in. When life came trembling into the world, he held it without fear. And that became the lesson. Not in what he did, but in what he chose not to abandon. That's the kind of presence that doesn't fade. It weaves into the fabric of every breath taken after, into every step the calf would one day take on his own, into every choice made with courage not born of instinct, but of example, of devotion, of a softness that never needed to harden to survive. Because what stays shapes, and what shapes lasts, and what shapes lasts. Not because it's carved into stone or spoken aloud in triumph, but because it becomes the way others live without even realizing why. It becomes the instinct to stand guard over another, the quiet refusal to leave when things get hard, the soft lean toward warmth when the world turns cold. And that shaping isn't fast, it isn't loud. It happens in the small hours, in the hush of breath shared between a father and his newborn, in the stillness after pain, in the choice to protect not because of duty, but because of something deeper, something chosen. He didn't lead with might, he led by remaining. And in that staying, he gave more than any roar or charge ever could. He gave a blueprint for love that didn't demand, didn't boast, didn't even explain itself. It simply showed up and stayed. And that became the whisper that traveled through the herd, from generation to generation, from story to silence, and from silence into the bones of those still walking the land. They didn't always speak of him, but when a young bull stood beside his mate, when a frightened calf felt no fear, when a circle formed around a birth or a loss, he was there, in presence, in pattern. In every moment, someone chose softness over strength and made space for both. That's how legacies are built, not in what's remembered, but in what is relived, again and again, in the gestures that feel like home, in the pauses that protect, in the strength that knows how to kneel. Because that is the kind of love that outlasts storms, outlives fear, and outshines anything written by tradition alone. It is not the loudest story, but it's the one that matters most. Because when all the noise fades, when every footstep grows quiet and every tradition stops echoing, it is the soft stories that remain, the ones carried in a glance, in the silent choice to stand beside, not in front, in the unshakable bond that forms not through conquest, but through care. That's what mattered most. Not who led the herd, not who roared the loudest, but who stood still when the world demanded motion, who stayed gentle when chaos pushed for retreat, who saw the trembling calf, the exhausted mother, the cracking sky, and said without a word, "I am here." And that presence, it didn't just shift that moment. It rewrote what fatherhood could look like. It redefined how strength is measured. It passed through the child like breath, like pulse, like memory. Not just shaping who he would become, but teaching him what to believe was possible. That staying isn't weakness, that softness isn't surrender, that showing up isn't the beginning of love. It's the proof of it, the daily act, the sacred vow, repeated without audience or applause. And years from now, when that calf stands in the same clearing with a newborn of his own, he won't remember every detail. He won't have to, because the story will already be written into his bones, into the way he shields without smothering, into the way he waits without wavering, into the way he stays, not because it's easy, but because once, long ago, someone stayed for him, and in doing so, made the world safer than fear, stronger than instinct, and far more beautiful than survival alone. Because surviving means getting through, but staying, that means building something worth returning to. It means creating a world where others don't just endure, but belong. And in that belonging, something shifts. Fear softens, guarded hearts lower, and the smallest members of the herd, the ones who don't yet have words for loss or love, begin to understand something far greater than instinct. They begin to feel safe. They begin to trust. They begin to stand taller, not because someone told them to, but because they were lifted, protected, and believed in long before they knew how to ask for it. That is what he left behind. Not a legacy of power, but of presence. Not dominance, but devotion. And the truth is, most who saw it wouldn't understand. They wouldn't recognize the quiet strength in a bull choosing stillness over spectacle, in lowering his massive body to be eye level with a calf, in guarding the night with ears alert, not because he was commanded, but because love had made a home in him too. And in that home, there was room for all of them, for pain, for joy, for the beginning again. And maybe that's what strength truly is. Not how hard you fight, but how deeply you stay. How wide your silence opens when words are useless. How fully your heart stretches when someone else's breath is unsteady. That day, the forest didn't witness a leader. It witnessed a father. One who stayed when leaving would have been easier. One who bent, not to break, but to shelter. And that kind of strength doesn't just change a moment. It changes the world the calf will grow into. It redefines what to expect from love, what to demand from loyalty, what to hope for when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Because when everything else feels like it's falling apart, when the winds howl louder than reason, when the ground feels too fragile to hold your weight, when grief presses against your ribs like something permanent, it's not the loudest voices we search for. It's not the leaders or the brave or the bold. It's the ones who stay, the ones who kneel in the broken places and say, "I'll hold this with you." The ones who don't flinch from pain, who don't look away from mess, who don't run from the weight of love when it starts to cost something. That's what the calf learned, not from lessons but from presence, not from stories but from footsteps that didn't fade. The sound of his father's breath, steady and close, the warmth of his shadow covering both of them in the darkest part of night. The unspoken vow in the way he didn't leave, that this world, brutal and beautiful and vast, could still make room for love that didn't run, that didn't require perfection, that didn't demand proof before giving comfort. And in that space, the calf grew, not just in body, but in belief, in the kind of deep, wordless knowledge that shapes generations, that tells you who you are because of who stayed. And years later, long after the world moved on, that calf would stand at the edge of another storm, with someone smaller pressed against his side, and he wouldn't hesitate, because the story had already been written in him, a story of a father who chose to stay, of strength measured not in steps taken, but in ones never walked away from, of safety born from silence, of hope reborn in stillness, and of love that never asked to be seen, only felt. And so, the calf lived, but not just in the way survival allows. He lived in the way that comes from being held, really held, in the soft, unwavering silence of someone who chose him, who didn't need language to say, "You matter," who didn't leave, not because he couldn't, but because love had already anchored him too deeply to walk away. They grew together, not just as father and child, but as something older than instinct and stronger than blood. They moved in rhythm, not just in body, but in spirit. Every step the calf took was a continuation of a promise. That presence would not be fleeting, that love could outlast the storm, that staying could rewrite every story that said it wasn't possible. The others would never know. They wouldn't see the nights spent curled together beneath the stars, the weight of a trunk draped protectively over small shoulders, the way the old bull would pause mid-step just to let the younger one catch up. They wouldn't hear the silent lessons passed from eye to eye, lessons about courage, about waiting, about how softness is not weakness, but power in its rarest form. But that calf knew, and he would carry that knowing into every herd he joined, into every life he touched, into the soil, the sound, the silence, because some stories don't end when the telling stops. They echo, they settle, they root. And for the rest of his days, that calf would live as proof of what happens when someone stays. Not because they have to, but because they choose to. If this moved you, stay soft, stay steady. That's what love remembers.